Hello, juniors, U.S. history students. Hope you're all doing okay in this. I think we're on day 59 or 60 of shelter in place. I'm coming to you here from my backyard. It's a nice day outside, and I figured this would be a good place for the lesson. I have to apologize for not having posted something earlier. It's been a crazy last couple of weeks with other um, responsibilities and activities, and I can't wait for the shelter in place to be over. I don't know about you guys. We're going to be wrapping up World War II, which actually coincides with the beginning of the Cold War. So a lot of people think that the Cold War started after World War II, but actually there's a major overlap. The Cold War starts during World War II. Oh, it's raining, kind of. Okay, so it actually starts during World War II. It's during the end of World War II, it became pretty evident that there was a lot of mistrust between the Soviets and the Americans. And a lot of it has to do with the ultimate defeat of Germany and what to do with Germany once it was defeated. It also has to do with the use of the atomic bomb in Japan, both of which we're going to talk about today. And then you guys are going to answer some reading questions about this. So I'll try to get through this fairly quickly. You guys already did some reading on this, but I kind of wanted to review since World War II is a pretty exciting unit of study, and I want to. I know it's not going to be the same as learning about it in the classroom and all the fun stuff we would have done with it, but uh, hopefully this kind of helps a little bit. I'll also post some videos as well. So basically, once America comes into the picture after Pearl Harbor, this is what Europe looks like. All of the red is the area that is controlled by the Axis, so Nazi Germany, but also Italy and its allies. So notice that Germany had invaded France. There's also, of course, Italy had invaded the Balkans, Greece, Poland. It had even gone into what is now Russia and got very close to Moscow, the capital city. Had also invaded Leningrad, which used to be St. Petersburg. So the Soviet Union is under attack and is trying to fight off the Germans and drive them back towards Germany. You also have North Africa that has been invaded by Nazi and Italian forces as well. So the job that Americans had, along with the British at this point, is to start at the very bottom. So look at right there where Egypt is. Look at Egypt on the map. And that was going to be the starting point. From there, we would have to drive the Germans east towards Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. And once they were defeated in North Africa, then they would have to hop north across the sea, across the Mediterranean Sea, into Sicily and then Italy. They spent 18 months, a year and a half, in this brutal campaign to liberate Italy. They would literally have to climb from the very toe of the boot that is the Italian peninsula and then fight their way north until they got to the French border. It was during that time, of course, that Italy surrenders. Mussolini is actually taken prisoner. Hitler helps him escape. It's this insane story. I could post a link to it as well. But then Mussolini escapes, and then he goes back to Italy. He's assassinated. It's like this really dramatic end to Italy's story in World War II. Meanwhile, France is also, the major holding that Germany has. So the Americans and the British are going to have to liberate France as well. Once they have that done, they can then start moving uh, east to Germany. Now, Russia, or the Soviet Union, on the other hand, is also going to be moving westward, I should say. I think I said east earlier, I'm sorry. Russia is also going to be moving westward towards Germany. Okay, they have to try to drive the Germans out. And so the ultimate goal is to meet in the middle, which is Germany. This is what the Pacific looks like. As you can see, the blue arrows point out all of the different battles that the Americans are going to have to fight on these teeny tiny islands that you can barely even register on the map. And they fight very fiercely for these islands. Each island is another stepping stone in towards mainland Japan. And then of course they have to liberate the Philippines while they're at it as well. So you can see from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then into Midway, even into up towards Alaska, like the Aleutian Islands. Then they're going to be fighting it's in the very southern part of the Pacific, which is like the Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, the Solomon Islands. Many of these battles took place entirely in the air. The enemy ships never even saw each other. Most of these battles took place with airplanes and bombers. So, and that was actually the first time in history that ever happened. Then from there, they would like literally hop from island to island until they got to the Philippines, then north towards Japan, taking the smaller islands first until eventually they could get to mainland Japan. Let's go back to Europe though. So the D-Day preparations had been in the works for about a year. And they had to do something to outsmart the Germans. The Germans assumed that the Americans would invade at Calais. If you look, that's the very top part of this map. Calais is only 25 miles away from the English shore. And so the Germans automatically assumed that they would take the shortest route and invade at Calais. In fact, the Allies even made it seem like they had preparations in the English shores across the channel from Calais to make the Germans think that that's what they were doing. In fact, they took a longer route, and they did this to outsmart the Germans in the hopes that they could catch them slightly less prepared. So they sailed from Portsmouth 95 miles instead of 25 miles across the sea, and they go into Normandy, which is where the D-Day beaches are. So it's a longer route, takes longer to get there. It's a much choppier sea. And so it was a really terrible voyage for those sailors who were on those ships overnight. And when they got there, many of them were seasick, of course. But it was a strategy that did work because the Germans were not as prepared at Normandy as they would have been at Calais. So when they get to Normandy, there's 5 different beaches, as you can see. And you've got different Allied troops. There's the British, the Canadians, and the Americans all landing at different beaches. Americans landed at Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. And then there was also Gold, Juno, and Sword Beach, which was landed by the British and the Canadians. And as you can imagine, this was a really horrific, treacherous battle. You had to get off the ships with carrying your weapon, carrying 80-pound bags, somehow avoid getting shot or blown up, make it across the sea, up the cliffs, through the barbed wire, and into the German bunkers to stop the machine gun fire. The night before, they had sent some paratroopers to land behind enemy lines and that they were supposed to be meeting up with, but it took a lot longer than they expected. It took many hours longer than they expected to meet up with their with their Allied paratroopers. But in the end, they did succeed. However, thousands of American, British, and Canadian lives were lost on this day just trying to get across that beach. Once they made it, though, they would spend the rest of that summer of 1944 working their way to Paris, liberating France inch by inch, mile by mile. So this is going to lead to the collapse of the Third Reich. They finally get to Paris on August 25th, 1944, and the city of Paris itself is liberated. Hitler freaks out, of course, because he has lost his main stronghold, which is France. France is this big buffer zone he has between himself and the Allies. So he makes a last desperate attempt to try to stop the Allies. He can try to stop them at the Belgian border, where there's a lot of forest. This is called the famous Battle of the Bulge, and it's a massive battle that takes place between December of 1944 to January of 1945. That should tell you that this is in the dead of winter. There's snow covering the forest grounds in Belgium. This forest is called the Ardennes, and this is also known as the Ardennes counteroffensive, or at least that's the way Hitler called it. But by the time we get to Christmas Day, the Germans were basically out of fuel and they were weakened. And by January 8th, they had begun to withdraw. I'm going to show you guys here a picture of what this might have looked like. So I want you to picture for a whole month Allied and German soldiers living in this snow-covered forest with very little shelter. Their beds were holes in the snow-covered ground that they would sleep in. There was very little food. The conditions were just awful. But still, somehow the Allies managed to break through. The reason why it's called the Battle of the Bulge is if you look at this map, And look at the shape of the German offensive here. The red arrows show the German offensive. The Germans were trying to essentially punch through uh, rather than try to like fight the Allies right through the border of Belgium. They were trying to punch through one, like imagine sort of like a hole going right through their defenses. Um, and they tried to make it, but instead the Allies managed to surround them and then drive them back. So that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, because of the sort of bulge shape that the German counteroffensive makes. Meanwhile, though, while this is happening, the Soviets are closing in from the east. If you take a look at this map, you see the blue, of course, shows the Allies. That's the Americans, the British, and now the liberated French are all driving east to Germany to liberate whatever is left that needs to be liberated. They're closing in on Berlin, which is the city where Hitler is stationed. Meanwhile, the Soviets are closing in from the east. They have liberated Poland, Hungary, they're entering Czechoslovakia. Keep in mind, of course, that as they are doing this, they are stumbling upon and liberating many concentration camps. This causes a flood of refugees who have nowhere to go. The Jews who were liberated from these concentration camps literally had nowhere to go. So at the same time, the Soviet troops are liberating these, they're also liberating massive floods of refugees who many of them are running straight into danger. So here's a more zoomed in version. This is the city of Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. And you can see how close the Allies are. The Allies are here in blue. That would be the Americans and the British and the French. But the Soviets got there first. Now, this is actually a pretty big deal. It's an important note that the Soviets got there first. They have the city of Berlin completely surrounded. And this all happens in the crazy month of April 1945. So here's how the war finally ends in Europe. As Soviet troops are attacking from the east, by February of 45, the Soviets were only about 35 miles away from Berlin. The Americans were at the Rhine, which is the border between France and Germany. Fast forward 2 months, we get to April 12th. This is the month that a lot of stuff happens. On April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt died of a stroke, and President Truman was sworn in. So he doesn't even get to see the end of the war take place. By April 16th, just 4 days later, the Soviets officially entered the city of Berlin. By this point, Hitler is still alive, and he's going crazy. He's, rearranging battle strategies as if they make a difference anymore. He refuses to accept that the war is lost. A week later, on April 25th, the city of San Francisco hosted the first UN conference. So you guys might remember that after World War I, they established the League of Nations, which the United States ended up never joining, and it fell apart, obviously, since no one listened to it. So many world leaders thought at this point that they should try again, something a little bit different this time. So they decide to draft a charter for this new version, the sort of League of Nations 2.0. They called it the United Nations this time. Essentially, it's the same idea. It's a group of nations that will use diplomacy to try to resolve problems and help countries in trouble and help refugees. This actually happens in the city of San Francisco, although the UN is technically headquartered today in New York. If you go to San Francisco today, if you take BART, get off at Civic Center Plaza, you're right smack in the middle of UN Plaza, right near City Hall. 3 days later, Mussolini was assassinated in Italy. He was actually assassinated by one of his own, by an Italian, and he and his right-hand man, as well as his mistress, her name was Clara Petracci, their bodies were then strung up upside down from some gallows, while crowds of Italian people went and beat and desecrated their bodies. Some journalists took photos of that, so you can actually see the picture of Mussolini's body hanging upside down. It was published in newspapers, and Hitler sees those pictures and he gets really scared. 2 days later, he commits suicide in his bunker with his mistress, Eva Braun. There are, of course, rumors that Hitler was still alive, that he escaped to Argentina. There's no evidence to confirm any of that. His body was probably, buried in some secret location. You don't want to give him a grave because then people might turn that into some sort of, martyrdom. So we don't know where Hitler is buried. He might have been buried at sea or cremated or something like that. And 1 week later, Germany surrendered. So today we celebrate May 8th, which was last week, as Victory in Europe Day. It's a great big celebration where many of the Allied countries today celebrate the, uh, the fact that they prevailed against the tyranny of the Nazis' world order. Okay, but let's go back to Germany, though. What happened to Germany then once Hitler is gone, the Nazis have been defeated? Can't really go back to normal life. Um, Remember that after World War One, Germany was punished severely for what it had done. Was blamed for the war and was punished severely. Was forced to pay a ridiculous amount of money that it didn't have. Um, well, obviously that didn't work, right? That actually just only gave rise to the Nazi power. So this time, the Allies figured, let's do something different. Let's actually help Germany recover. And that way, once Germany has recovered, they are less likely to turn to a tyrant like Hitler, who will, just scapegoat and use the anger and poverty of the German people once again to rise to power. They wanted to help Germany recover. So they decided that they would split the job up, and they would split Germany up into 4 occupation zones. If you look at this map, the British took the northwestern corner of Germany. The French took the southwestern corner of Germany, which happens to border with France. The Americans took the southern east corner of Germany. And then the Soviets kept, as you guys can see, the northeastern corner of Germany, which happens to also be where the city of Berlin resides. The idea was that between the 4 of them, they would help Germany recover and get back on its feet so that all thoughts of Nazism would disappear, hopefully, in Germany. But there's one problem, right? Because you've got the Allies, the Western Allies are capitalist democracies. But the Soviet Union is a communist dictatorship and run by a totalitarian dictator named Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin had actually zero plan, zero intention of helping this place recover. He wants revenge. And the Soviets actually, when they enter Eastern Germany and Berlin, they actually start to like take apart German factories, and they literally like send those parts of the factories back to the Soviet Union. They take resources, they take revenge on the citizens. They essentially strip Eastern Germany of anything that could have possibly helped it recover economically. The Allies know what Stalin's plan is, and they don't like it. America had actually been onto this, and so had Britain for a while. They feared that this is exactly what the Soviet Union would do. They couldn't stand up to Stalin at the time because they needed Stalin's help to defeat Germany. So their hands were essentially tied. The problem, of course, is that the Allies know that the Soviet Union plans to spread communism. And so this is a huge concern because they feel that the Soviet Union has already done this to the rest of Eastern Europe. And they want to try to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding communism even more. So this is now we start to think, we start to focus on Japan. The United States is really concerned about this because it's too late to do anything about Eastern Europe and what Stalin is doing over there. But now they also have to worry about ending the war with Japan because that's still going on. So they start to come up with strategies for how to defeat Japan. They firebombed the city of Tokyo in November of 1944. Keep in mind, I'm backtracking here. This takes place a month before the Battle of the Bulge even happens in Europe. By February of 1945, okay, so if you think about it, at this point, they've already entered Germany by February of 1945. But in Japan, or in the Pacific, this is still happening, and there is no end in sight yet. The famous Battle of Iwo Jima takes place in February of 1945. And this is sort of like a D-Day take 2. It's the D-Day of the Pacific. They faced the same kinds of conditions that they had faced on D-Day in Normandy. 60,000 Marines landed on Iwo Jima, and 6,800 of them died, were shot to death, or blown up by explosives, just trying to land and get across the beaches of Iwo Jima. Um, as a result, though, eventually the Americans did prevail at a massive human cost. They then used Iwo Jima as a sort of starting point to launch bomber planes, and they firebombed 67 Japanese cities with napalm in order to destroy all the Japanese war production. So they purposely target cities in Japan that are producing materials needed for the Japanese war. Napalm, by the way, is a sort of explosive, sticky substance, kind of like Vaseline, but it burns white hot. And it's also later on used in Vietnam. And it's incredibly deadly and explosive and spreads very quickly. So using napalm to firebomb cities was pretty effective. It also kills a lot of civilians. Despite that, though, the Japanese did not surrender. Some people might say that's probably something that was sort of bred into the Japanese from the days of the samurai, where surrender was considered the most dishonorable thing you could do. Death was better than surrender. So the United States was convinced that Japan would never surrender unless it was actually invaded. But invading Japan was a scary thought because of how difficult even just the invasion of Iwo Jima had proven to be. They then decided to invade an island, a small island, 350 miles away from the mainland of Japan, the island of Okinawa. And they figured they could use this as a base because back then the planes couldn't travel that many miles. They couldn't travel as far because of fuel capacities. So they figured this island could be used as a base from which to launch our planes for firebombing and invading Japan. It would make the invasion a lot easier. They are hoping that the Emperor of Japan will step down and surrender, but the Japanese are unlikely to let that happen. This is the famous photograph many of you guys are familiar with once Iwo Jima was taken successfully by the Americans, once again at a massive human cost. But this picture, of course, appears in newspapers and it inspires American patriotism amongst the citizens back home in continuing the war effort against Japan. So the invasion of Japan is daunting, right? Like they're not sure they can do this again. It would be like repeating what had just happened in France all over again. The American government is hoping that there is a more efficient and easier way, and there is. It's called the Manhattan Project. What's interesting about this, of course, as you guys know, is this is the project that develops the atomic bomb. And it had been influenced by the research of physicists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, who, by the way, were Jewish scientists who had escaped Nazi Germany. And they had done this research on splitting uranium atoms and the energy, of course, that can be harnessed from that. But what's interesting is that the Manhattan Project had actually been formed, or the Committee to Research the Atomic Bomb had been formed way back in 1939, the year that the war began. But this is 2 years prior to America's entry into the war. This was started by FDR. This goes to show that, once again, FDR had plans even before America had ever entered the war. There was actually a British committee that had already been working on it, and so FDR just ensured that American and British forces would join. Basically put their heads together here. So he funds the Manhattan Project to build the bomb, and then it is first tested in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in July of 1945. July of 1945 is 1 month before the bomb is actually going to be used. I can't right now, I'm sorry. This is a secret lab in New Mexico led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, the head researcher. By July of 1945, by the way, Germany had already been defeated. So a lot of people will ask, well, why didn't we just use the bomb on Germany? Well, it hadn't actually been successfully used or tested yet by July of 1945. But the war is still going on with Japan by this time. So this is like brand new, just in the nick of time sort of research that has just occurred. So, but as soon as they test the bomb, they essentially send Japan a warning. This is after the Potsdam Conference, which takes place. And the Allies warn Japan of total destruction. They don't actually say that they had an atomic bomb or what the bomb could do. They just said that they would face total destruction. There are also accounts that the United States actually did warn the city of Hiroshima by dropping leaflets and warnings written in Japanese, telling the citizens that they should probably evacuate because a major bomb was about to be dropped. However, Japan was used to being bombed by the Americans, and that's what they thought, that this was just going to be another of the fire bombings that had taken place. So on August 6th of 1945, after the Potsdam Conference, in which they had warned the Japanese, America drops the atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. It's an industrial city. The bomb instantly kills somewhere between 80,000 to 120,000 people. This is not counting the number of people who would later die from radiation. If you think about what an atomic bomb is, it uses radiation, right? Just like your microwave. So it's basically what happens after the bomb goes off is that the city continues to sort of be microwaved, be cooked for hours, for days later. Many people who were actually not even near the bomb when it landed, and some of them were miles and miles away, began to experience burns hours later. After the bomb had already gone off, because of the radiation energy that continues to stick around afterwards. Now, many people consider the second bomb to be the more controversial one, because 3 days later, the Soviet Union actually declared war on Japan. Now, this is what really gets America to sort of panic. The United States wants to end the war with Japan, but they also do not want the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan. Why not? Well, what was the Soviet Union doing when they invaded countries? Look at what they had done to Eastern Europe. Everywhere the Soviet Union invaded, they spread communism. They set up a communist puppet government, and it was under the control of Joseph Stalin. Essentially, they were just replacing Nazism with communism, with totalitarian communism, or Stalinism, as some people call it. So as soon as the Soviet Union declares war on Japan, the United States thinks, well, now Japan's going to be a communist state run by the Soviet Union. If we let them invade, that's what they're going to turn it into. So since Japan had not actually surrendered unconditionally at that point, America makes the very hasty decision to drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. This was in the hopes that this would render the Soviet invasion unnecessary. If Japan surrendered, the Soviet Union would have no reason to invade Japan. If they don't invade Japan, they can't spread communism there. They also did it, many people believe, to intimidate the Soviet Union, to show the Soviet Union what we could do. And by all accounts, it does work, because this bomb kills 35,000 to 74,000 dead instantly. The Emperor of Japan orders an immediate surrender, and August 15th, 1945 is celebrated as Victory in Japan Day. The Soviet Union never invaded Japan. Today, Japan is a capitalist mecca, if you will, and has never even dabbled in communism. Unlike North Korea and China, which the Soviet Union did have a major influence on. Here's a map showing, sorry, my dog is barking. Here's a map showing the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, where the bombs landed. This is Paul Tibbets, the pilot. Stop it, Izzy. Paul Tibbets is the pilot of the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, that actually dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And this is what Hiroshima looks like now, after, not now, but after dropping the bomb. And I want, obviously you can see just like a vast wasteland and flattened city. But before, Hiroshima was a major city with skyscrapers and factories, and it was a major bustling industrial city. Here's Nagasaki as well, including the mushroom cloud over the city of Nagasaki. As you can see, the smoke is and debris is so massive that it even, goes above the clouds. That's how big the explosion is. You can see, of course, Nagasaki on the top picture, Nagasaki before, and then completely flattened in the picture below at ground zero. These are famous photographs of what happens when an atomic bomb is dropped. The first picture on the left shows you the shadow of a man and a ladder against a wall. Think about what the flash of an atomic bomb looks like. Is very similar to like a camera flash and how it uses light and darkness to make a picture. So this building obviously is very far away from ground zero. Otherwise, the wall wouldn't even be there. But just the flash itself, even though it was miles and miles away, didn't burn down the building, but it did imprint the man's shadow and the ladder onto the wall where it was standing. I don't know what happened to the man or the ladder, but probably they must have experienced some sort of injury. The other picture is a woman with burns on her skin, as you can see. So I apologize for the graphic nature of this. You might notice that the burns have an interesting pattern. That is because she was far enough away from the explosion that it did not kill her, obviously. But just the flash itself, the energy from the bomb, was enough to, very similar to what a microwave does when you cook your food in it, was enough to actually burn the patterns from the silk kimono she was wearing onto her skin. So it's very similar, again, like how a camera and film use shadow and light to make a picture in darkness. That's exactly what happens here. So this goes to show you the effects of the bomb, even when you are far away enough to avoid being killed by it. As you can imagine, the use of atomic bombs is incredibly controversial. That was the only time atomic bombs have ever been used in a war. And I don't have an answer for you whether or not it is appropriate or ethical or correct to use an atomic bomb. There, of course, are arguments against it, and there were arguments for it. We do know that we can never use an atomic bomb now because in 1945, we were the only country that had them. Today, more than 9 or 10 countries have atomic bombs. If one country uses an atomic bomb, other countries will then do so as well. So that would create, of course, some sort of apocalyptic nuclear war, and it's something that we can't do. We could literally destroy ourselves in the process. So World War II is probably famous for opening the door to this strange solution. On the one hand, it worked. It put an end to this war, this horrific, catastrophic war. On the other hand, we have created the very technology that is capable of killing us. This also, of course, starts the Cold War. The Soviet Union, knowing and seeing that the United States had atomic weapons, then strives to attain its own, and is successful in doing so. Much of the Cold War was based around the idea that the Soviets were attaining nuclear weapons and could potentially use them against us. It was also based on the idea that the Soviet Union was spreading communism and the United States had a responsibility to stop it. So that's where World War I ends, but the Cold War begins. I'm going to leave it there for now. I want you guys to think about whether or not you think it would be right to use a nuclear weapon today to end a war, and what the implications for that might be. Obviously, many people are against it, not just because of the sheer number of people that can be killed by a nuclear bomb, but what it means for humanity to be able to kill that many human beings and destroy that much of our land and our planet in a matter of seconds. It's a really frightening thought. So, guys, I'm going to leave you here with that and your assignment, and I hope that you have enjoyed my lecture on this. I know it was kind of long, but to be fair, I haven't done this in a long time, so I hope you guys don't mind. At least you can hit the pause button if you get tired of listening to me. I will be uploading some lessons on the Cold War tomorrow, And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of this strange week, going on day 60 of shelter in place. I hope to see you all soon. Bye, guys.